Hi, if you want to watch exclusive content with hot girls that you won't watch on YouTube, namely where Naruto roasts Kushina and Mikoto and many other hot girls without restrictions, then visit my Boosty channel at the link in the description. POVQB, but Yoko. The complete darkness around and the news of submission cloud the mind, and when the hated control subsides and I begin to become aware of the world around me, I clearly understand how bad and good everything is at the same time. Blood, death, pain. Everything around is soaked in them. It seems I have found the worst possible moment for my manifestation. And I have been used again. Against my will, simply by taking over my consciousness. A disgusting feeling, but the body is so light. It has been a long time since all 9 tails have bristled so militantly in different directions. The fight, almost a massacre, is intoxicating. Maybe I should say, thank you to my impudent guide? But first kill him for daring to use me, and then I can say, as an exception, so to speak, I was torn from my thoughts by the people who were so desperately attacking me. Stupid, as if a couple of kunai and small, almost toy, explosives could hurt me. Their panic prevents them from concentrating and enjoying, finally, the long-awaited freedom. I inhale the dusty air, saturated with the scent of the forest, with full lungs, and unable to restrain myself, I let out an ecstatic roar. This is the world. I have wanted to feel it again for so long. With a crash, I lower my paw onto something, continuing to growl enthusiastically, digging my claws into the ground, scraping, leaving jagged wounds in its thickness. I beat my tails, enjoying the already forgotten feeling of all-consuming power. A light breeze ruffles the fur, sorts through each hair. It seems to greet me, remember, and stroke me tenderly. And people keep yelling and attacking. What do I care about them when I finally feel alive again? Free? Euphoria clouds my vision. The attacks, like mosquito bites, do not hurt. I tense my hind legs, it's time to leave. Of course, I really want to tear everything down to hell here, but I know this nasty village and its inhabitants too well. The roar fades, the thought of a graceful exit tears away the last shreds of euphoria that clouded my mind. It's time to get going, and I'm ready for it. But suddenly the body is once again entangled in such familiar chains, knocking the ground out from under the paws. Kushina! I desperately scratch the ground with my claws, tearing at the chains, exhausted. The impudent girl is sitting on her knees very close. I glance at her sideways. Her scarlet hair is tangled and soaked in the same red blood. There are bruises under her eyes, she has no strength at all. But she is stubborn. A nasty woman. I reach out to stand up again. To get up. To get out of these prickly pale yellow irons. And they are everywhere. Even just hanging in the air. It looks like hot wire, randomly strung across the area. And I am a violator. I was caught, and it is so disgusting. These impudent little people are asking for a beating. I just want to howl. How I hate them. Especially at this shameful moment for me. It was just now that the great 9-tailed demon fox had to give in to almost childish delight. You see, he liked the air. So much so that he forgot about the persistent leaves circling around. Insolent and armed too. I take a deep breath, trying to calm myself, and pull the paw pinned to the ground toward me. If I act slowly and thoughtfully, I should be able to get free. At the same time, I begin to move the 3rd tail from the left to the side. The chain trembles slightly. And so do I. I turn my gaze to the little man. Aha! She's not alone anymore. Next to her is the equally hateful blonde, Minato, bright, fast, nasty. Correct. And with a child in his arms, too. They brought out another blonde and loud one, you see. But the girl holding the chains is very weak, but she is stubborn. She mumbles something, scolds her husband. And he is already in his raincoat. Are you going to fight me or something? I snort softly, trying not to distract them. Let them talk, if possible, forget about me altogether. And I'll sit here for now, untangling my tails and paws. Again I carefully pull the tail towards me, this time the second one from the right. A quiet growl in response. Only the child howls loudly. It hits my ears. If he weren't so angry, maybe he would have politely asked these grief-stricken parents to calm him down. But as it is, all that's left is to growl faintly. I don't like children. They are loud, impudent, They howl at first, and then they learn to talk, they parody us, the tailed ones, and they grow up to be people. Disgusting, disgusting. I hook the nearest chain with the tip of my claw and yank it sharply, seeing that the girl and the blonde have come to some common conclusions. The shackles jingle loudly, but they don't drown out the little brat's screams. For me, at least. But not for these, inferior ones. And I growl loudly again, almost howl, realizing that I have sped up the almost inevitable. The blonde, that damn Namikaze Minato, begins to form seals. 1, 2, 3. I realize with horror what he is going to do. Seal me. No way. And even tear off a decent chunk. I won't give it to you. I start to desperately twitch in my chains, tearing, ripping the ground with my claws. In my head there is only a frantic desire to tear apart those who even thought of this. Another seal, and the chakra starts to leave me in spurts. Anger turns me into an animal naked instincts, malice, despair, hatred. With a tiny edge of consciousness I register the fact that the frantic movements have confused me even more. There is no way out of the chains. Although I have achieved one of the goals. The brazen captors were now hanging, bleeding, from one of my claws. The protection of the screaming lump of flesh was clearly fatal for them. And then the yellow-haired impudent fellow obviously with difficulty exhales. The seal of the 5 elements. And I understand that this is the end for me too. A desperate howl covers the entire space around me, when I begin to be torn apart, and then sucked into the disgusting in their clarity and precision lines on the belly of the impudent screamer. Oh, how I hate people! Arrrrrrrrr! I exhale loudly and uncontrollably, finding myself in a gilded cage up to my tailbone in water. Arrrrrrrr! My roar fills the air. Tails bristle again, but this time only to avoid getting wet. An unpleasant place. A cramped cage. Again confinement. 1 step to the right, 2 to the left, that's my whole new world. Although the bright, like the hair of the impudent fellow I killed, bars of the cage also provide a view of the rest of the room, but it is not much different from what is right behind me. Gray walls and lots of water. Angrily, almost hissing, I envelop everything around me in flames, evaporating the water, but only in my cage. The scarlet tongues of power barely touch the space behind the bars. I throw my whole body against the metal partition. I howl again, this time from pain. The smell of slightly singed wool creeps through the room. I fall to the floor, thrown back by the seal. Powerlessness. A disgusting feeling. I cover my muzzle with my tails, leaving only my eyes visible. Scarlet, with an elongated pupil. With the remnants of my chakra, I visually enlarge my eyes 4 times. Darkness envelopes me, as if trying to calm me down. But how can I calm someone who has once again lost the freedom he so desired? The grinding of my teeth echoes in my ears. All I can do is wait, preparing for the stupid, light-haired screamer to stumble one day, giving me another chance for another breath of air. And I will wait. Waiting may not be my strong point, but lately I seem to have gotten the hang of it. This boy won't resist. Not when I've had another taste of freedom. The darkness of an almost empty room, in which the only thing that towered above was a gilded cage. If such a colossus, obviously created for containment, can be called by the impersonal word, thing. Thin strips of light in the impenetrable darkness, as if specially concentrated there, deep in the bowels of this almost majestic structure, cast a pale yellow cast on the rods. A grid designed to contain. A clear prison for something scary, dark, evil. An indomitable force that might have been hiding somewhere in one of the corners of this forced darkness. And the quiet echo of drops rhythmically hitting the floor. Time after time breaking the stifling silence. Drip, drip, with an even interval of half a minute. A quiet and measured sound, so organically blended into the atmosphere of gloomy, wary anticipation. The silence was so heavy, as if the beast inside the cage was not sleeping, sprawled out and spreading out to the sides, as far as there was room, all 9 red tails, but was waiting, frozen, tensing its heavy paws. Suddenly, a sharp flash of light cut through the darkness. It illuminated the room for just a second and then went out, bringing with it a loud sound. Crying. A screaming child lay on a relatively dry patch of floor. His roar echoed throughout the room, which had suddenly lost all its air of mystery and danger. From the depths of the cage, Huge scarlet eyes flashed irritably, followed by huge white fangs. And the child continued to strain himself, twitching and spinning like a top, not paying attention to the creepy-looking neighbor, who was looking at him angrily through the bars of the cage. "Arr!" Unable to bear such an attention, the fox spoke up. For just a moment the scream stopped, only to ring out again a second later. The sobbing continued for 10 long minutes, very long for the nerves of the red-haired prisoner. The fox spent them without taking his angry gaze off the 2 bloody bowls from the bundle with the child. The little boy's hands periodically emerged from under the white rag into the ugly acid-yellow circle in which he was carelessly wrapped. The terrible, bloodshot eyes slowly closed and just as slowly opened again. With a loud hiss, the beast sucked in the lion's share of the air in the room. So much that the child fell silent in shock, feeling the lack of oxygen, which gave him an excellent opportunity to continue making loud screams. The fox exhaled heavily, giving the space a warm wave that warmed the discontentedly grimacing child. The child hooted encouragingly, and then, as if imitating a new acquaintance, loudly and somehow desperately sucked in more air, swelling like a balloon and intending to continue the concert without requests. But he did not have time. The almost finished tirade was interrupted by a drawn-out voice, imbued with the hoarseness characteristic of a bass. "Shut up, will you?" The fox finally dispelled the illusion of huge, mind-pressing, intimidating eyes and a malicious grin, appearing before the child in his true form. Blue, tear-filled eyes stared in interest through the slowly spreading darkness evoked by the nine-tails chakra. QB sighed heavily again, clicking his not very large, after the terrifying genjutsu, teeth and tiredly twitched his 9th tail, which was closest to the locked gates of his prison. The children's hands, with interest, finally disentangled themselves from the rag that was holding them back and with great interest jerked towards the fox, clenching their little fists with force. The child showed obvious interest in the bright, shaggy miracle. The little body tensed up, and then jerked with all its might, striving towards the cage. The plump lips pursed tensely. The light eyebrows came together on the bridge of the nose. A couple more concentrated pushes. And the child, almost completely hidden in the dark, icy water that had only miraculously not washed him before, began to whine resentfully. The lips pouted sweetly, the huge bright blue eyes overflowed with tears, the hands rolled in the water. The baby did not like being wet. "It's a small thing, don't interfere, otherwise you'll drown." The fox drawled a little detachedly, still observing the first experience of moving the intolerable little nuisance. "Although it will even be interesting." The redhead bared his teeth. "You will be the first fool to drown in the excess of your own chakra." The child jerked again, pursing his pale lips, and with even greater persistence moved forward, sliding down into the water up to his neck. "Just like his parents," muttered the fox, raising himself and carefully moving so that his narrow red muzzle was as far away as possible from the impudent obstacle, who was still concentrating on trying to commit an act of stubborn suicide. The child began to whine again, but stubbornly continued to twitch, going deeper and deeper under the water. The demon, sighing heartbreakingly, nevertheless took a step forward and, releasing the 4th tail from the right, pulled it up to the bars. The baby froze, watching with interest the inaccessible, but so desired toy. The crease between the light eyebrows smoothed out, and the blue eyes widened slightly, intently watching how the tail, approaching the bars, began to thin out. Now it looked more like a moving cord or some kind of whip, slightly thicker than a finger. The red, furry limb carefully slid out. The child slightly inclined his head and with interest transferred his gaze, too intelligent for a newborn, from the slowly approaching tail to the fox's face filled with pain. The demon clearly did not enjoy this unauthorized foray outside the cage. He barely restrained himself from growling. His long fangs showed even more from his mouth in a poisonous grin, and his eyes narrowed, as if hiding the pain floating in them. "Trifles." The 9-tailed fox wheezed as the thin part of the limb finally wrapped around the small body. The fox frowned, feeling how even underwater his wet fur was being felt by children's hands, how fingers were grabbing the darkened hairs with force, awkwardly trying to keep them for themselves forever. There was no longer any strength left to endure the not strong, but constant and ever-increasing pain, and then the demon simply pulled the boy towards himself, almost pressing the child, who was not at all frightened by the sharp movement, into one of the bars. The tail immediately sucked back into the painless darkness of the cage. Now the demon and the man were not just looking into each other's eyes. They were feeling each other's breath. Blue eyes with ever-increasing interest looked straight into the demon's scarlet eyes, forcing him to squint uncomfortably. No daredevil had ever dared to lock eyes with the fox for such a long time. Even the Uchihas had never been so insane. What can I say? The nine-tailed fox had killed for less. But now he and the impudent one were separated by wide bars of the cage. The child's eyes began to study the demon frozen in front of him. The child, without ceasing, moved his hands and twisted, expressing his impatience and interest. Not a drop of fear. This is what struck the fox most. So much so that he missed the fist that was too close, which immediately grabbed the red fur, grabbing as much as it could fit between the greedy fingers. The demon shuddered more from surprise than pain and jerked back slightly, dragging the baby along with him. The child puffed harder in concentration, squeezing the still clumsy fingers. So fragile and very small with ridiculous redness and thin bones. For some reason, it was these unexpected thoughts that made the demon stop, and then take a cautious step forward, hesitantly pressing his nose to the bars. A long red ear poked out, which the second fist immediately grabbed in a proprietary manner. The hands were holding confidently, although not tightly. The child grunted contentedly, stretching his toothless mouth into a smile. "And how old are you, little one?" Fox asked suddenly, even to himself, looking at the pink gums with interest. And then, with increasing bewilderment, he slid his thoughtful gaze over the body that had almost lost its diaper. Small. Weak. Very thin and too pink. The demon bowed his head even lower, beginning to examine the wrinkled leg with a rounded heel, so dangerously almost touching his fangs. At this time, the child continued to squeeze and try to stuff the red fur into his mouth. From the sharp movements, the rag, which was obviously carelessly wrapped around the child's body, completely slid onto the wet floor. The child winced, clearly not pleased with this circumstance. "So what are you twitching about?" Fox said in a bewildered bass voice, still recovering from his detailed examination of the baby. He had never seen such little ones before, especially so close. Although if you think about it, from his usual height the demon would not have noticed such a tiny thing. Now Fox was even afraid to guess how old the creature in front of him might be. "Listen, are you even human?" Nine-Tailed sniffed warily, continuing to grumble. "You never know. What could that crazy woman have given birth to, and with such a male, too?" The child laughed loudly, as if he really understood something in the monologue of the beast sitting on the other side of the bars. "Are you really a human?" The scarlet eyes looked at him with bewilderment. "You smell like a human, I think. But you look, not so good. And completely stupid." The fox thought out loud, looking and sniffing. His thoughts were busy comparing his parents and the impudent fellow in front of him. He was so deep in himself that he did not notice how the child stuck his head into the cage, sticking out his tongue and clearly trying to lick the demon's nose. "No teeth, maybe you're an anteater?" "No, you don't look like one. Wrinkled, all too pink. No color, no fur, not even like those people of yours." The fox closed his eyes, clearly trying to find an answer to his own question. "Human or not human? It doesn't look like a turtle either. 2 arms, 2 legs. It seems to have fingers. As many as 5 on each paw." The red tail stuck out a little again. Fortunately now it didn't have to stretch far, and felt the baby from head to toe. "No tails in sight. At least there is fur on your head. And you seem to be the same color as your father." The fox moved his tails in thought. And the child, having finally reached the fox's muzzle, exhaled enthusiastically right into his nose and began to drool with concentration on the wet tip. The demon shuddered and backed away, pushing the child away with his paw, who immediately screamed from the push. Tears began to accumulate in the blue eyes, and the child's hands jerked with a force unusual for children, tearing out a dozen long hairs from the red skin. The demon froze in fear, winced slightly and pressed his ears, trying to muffle the loud cry, but then he felt a strange push. The water around the cage began to ripple, and the child began to gradually dissolve in the air. "Someone's going to wake up from their own roar now," the fox muttered, backing away, as if trying to escape the annoying sobs that would probably irritate his sensitive ears for another half hour after the unknown little animal disappeared. But Fox clearly didn't expect that he would be pulled after the kid. Twisted and sucked in. Literally pulled out by force with a nasty slurping sound. And it would obviously start with the tails. The demon seemed to have been shoved into a huge raisin gan. Bones were crushed, flesh was destroyed and seemed to be rebuilt. The fox felt like he was being turned inside out, and his ears were still pounding with the full of incomprehension and resentment scream of the unbearable child of his previous jailer. The fox had not had time to find out whether he was a human. But now he was twisted and broken. One could even say, rinsed and wrung out. He had once seen through Kushina's eyes the woman was just getting ready to give birth, and the seal had weakened quite a bit, allowing him to have fun like this sometimes. Recalling the strangeness of people he had never seen in a military situation before Uzumaki, the feeling of aches and pains finally began to diminish, gradually fading to nothing. The fox carefully opened his closed eyes and froze. There was no familiar cage, no darkness to hide the sense of space around it, and no water either. There was none. As if in contrast, everything was white. The ceiling, the floor, the walls. Directly opposite the fox stood a crudely knocked-together crib, in which the Uzumaki and Nameke's puppy was still noisily screaming. The fox hurried to the window visible slightly to the side. Still in disbelief, the demon looked at such familiar, not to him, Kushina, views of the square in front of the hospital and the Hokage mountain, which seemed familiar to every feature not only to the Uzumaki girl, but to himself as well. Only a second later did the realization come that something was wrong with the fox himself. The nine-tailed beast lowered his gaze, examining himself everywhere his gaze reached, and choked on a mournful howl. Then he closed his eyes and repeated the examination with his suddenly appeared hands. Well then, the fox, or was he a fox now, began to think out loud again. 4 paws, ahem, that is, 2 legs and the same number of arms. No fur. Unusually short and unprotected fingers touched the head, feeling the familiar stiffness of fur. Only on a new body it seemed, it was called hair. The only thing that distinguished him from the hated humans was his tails. Yes. All 9 of them were in place. But the body itself, and its location in space. The demon carefully shifted from one foot to the other, getting used to it, and fighting the urge to stand on all 4s. His tails desperately beat the floor, and his ears, still as sensitive as ever, did not pick up any extraneous sounds except, of course, the boy's sobs. And this seemed strange to the demon. That no one would respond to the child's call. What kind of creatures surround you? The 9-tailed fox cautiously approached the fidgety little one's obvious sleeping place again, and irritably nudged him with his unfamiliar limb, causing him to sway a couple of times. The child immediately turned down the volume a little, looking sideways at his new acquaintance with interest. Why are you silent? The fox carefully touched the baby with his bald paw, pushing him towards the rag in which he had been wrapped. The strange garment rolled up slightly, revealing a small sign sewn onto it. The fox narrowed his eyes, bending down lower towards the object of interest. Uzumaki Naruto. The look of scarlet eyes measured the child with annoyance. Let's get acquainted, my new prison. In irritation, using all the strength available to his new body, the fox pushed the crib again, but did not drop it as he wanted, but only made it swing. Growled in irritation, the demon decided to try again, but did not have time. Footsteps were heard in the adjacent room, and the fox again felt something grab him and drag him, dragging him through the already familiar funnel. In the empty room, the baby's crib was still rocking, with a quiet child who had unusually blue eyes and an already attractive, but toothless, smile. A heavy sigh cut through the oppressive silence. The fox stretched his entire body, opened his mouth wide, unable to hold back a yawn. He opened one scarlet eye, somewhat lazily beginning to explore his familiar surroundings. Darkness, a caged water. Fell asleep? The demon thoughtfully raised his paw, admiring the sharp, kunai-like claws. Just like that? The long ear twitched slightly to the side, as if the prisoner was listening to himself. I didn't fall asleep, the fox stated, finally feeling the threat of power inside himself. Quite thin, I must say. What the hell was that? One of the tails flicked the water, creating huge circles on the dark surface. And was there any? The fox closed his eyes, plunging into memories, thinking about what he saw, trying to understand whether he saw reality, or whether the abnormal Uzumaki and others like them played another joke on the Biju. Lost in thought, he began to move his paw along the floor, filling the room with a loud scraping sound. His claws met the stone surface again and again, but the fox did not seem to even notice it. Only the periodic twitching of his ears betrayed that he was awake. Suddenly, Demon was blinded for a second. Bright light literally permeated everything around, and sounds, on the contrary, seemed to disappear completely. This terrible flash lasted only a second, blinding the Ninetales, and then forcing him to blink actively, accompanied by an even more disgusting sound than before. Crying. Or rather, roaring. At the top of a huge child's throat. The fox jumped up on his paws, practically slamming his head into the stone ceiling. "Oh, shut up!" The red tails beat against the bars of the cage in irritation, as if testing the strength of the prison. "I already realized that everything was real. And you too, you little thorn." The huge body sank down onto the heated stones again. The fox covered his head with his front paws, and then with his tails. The nasty sound came from everywhere. "Don't cry, little one!" The strongest demon of the 9 in existence exhaled, clearly trying to suppress a groan full of suffering. "I can hear you anyway. And judging by the way you, Nightmare, are screaming, you are not an illusion," the tailed one began to think out loud. It was not clear why he was doing this. No one heard him. And not only because of the children's screams, but in general, in the subconscious of this, Naruto, there was only the fox and the screaming lump, which, by the way, was not visible. Perhaps it was just force of habit. Eternal loneliness leaves its mark. Or perhaps it was convenience. QB. But Yoko wasn't about to explain that to anyone. "Assuming you're not a hallucination." The demon moved his ear uncertainly, afraid to believe in his luck. The little parasite fell silent as soon as the demon came to terms with his reality. "So I really heard you. I really touched you," and the tailed one listened incredulously, sticking his nose out from under his clawed paws. "I saw the village." Nightmare chuckled loudly. "What do you understand?" The Nine-tailed exhaled in confusion. The understanding of his own words had fallen just a couple of seconds ago, and still did not want to become part of reality. The demon was confused, shocked, and full of indignant disbelief. "How did this ever happen?" The demon decided to clarify. Well, what if? The little one was reacting too suspiciously adequately and in time. And the fox himself was not sure that the human puppies were developing according to the scenario familiar to him. Although now he could assume anything. The miracle had already happened. Bright. Sharp. So sudden that he even realized it belatedly, and with such a suddenness that he wanted to bang his face against the bars or destroy a couple of settlements. "Oh!" came from everywhere again, forcing the demon to rise heavily, looking around. The beast's gaze slid around the room, carefully checking every corner, even the darkest one. Sensitive ears twitched slightly, listening. "Are you howling here or not?" Fox asked experimentally, still not finding the nasty source of the sound, which was in no hurry to respond this time. The silence dragged on. The demon did not move, even closed his eyes in anticipation. Only the red tails swayed slowly, betraying his impatience. "Well?" The demon lowered his paw onto the water-soaked floor, leaving 5 slightly curved scratches on the floor. The screeching sound rolled through the room like a shock wave and spread further, beyond its limits, where the beast's gaze could no longer reach. But there was still no answer. The fox winced slightly, trying to get comfortable on the icy floor. He moved his tails to the side, folded his paws, resting his elongated muzzle on them, and stared into the darkness. The gaze of his scarlet eyes rested right on the rag left on the very border between the subdued light and the darkness. It was completely soaked and had matted into an ugly lump, as if it had been saturated with the atmosphere of the room, becoming part of it. The demon was not particularly bothered by time boundaries. They were simply not provided for in the space of someone else's, especially a child's, subconscious. Therefore, he was tormented by doubts about how long he had been examining the thing that had lost its color and shape. Maybe a couple of minutes, hours, or even several days. The silence was deafening. It enveloped everything around so tightly that the fox was almost ready to start talking to the impudent little man again or, in the worst case, listen to his terrible squeak. Suddenly, something changed in the stale, damp air, causing the beast to brace himself. The air was so dangerous that Nine-Tailed Fox bared his teeth and growled, his red fur standing on end and his tails whistling through the air. The scarlet eyes opened wide, as if trying to increase visibility even more. A heavy, wary gaze screwed into the darkness. Tense, like a taut string, the fox waited. Anxiety did not leave the huge animal figure, which with each passing second grew in size. And then everything changed. The scarlet eyes widened even more, threatening to fall out at any moment. And the demon himself suddenly froze, looking more and more like a statue. Even the furiously thrashing tails froze in mid-swing. Because the fox saw gray walls all around, but not like those in his new prison, but covered with a thin ligature of fuin. The black abyss of the passage that stretched and stretched forward, and the man who carried him in his arms. The nine-tailed fox slowly, afraid to frighten the vision, sank to the floor and froze, peering at what was happening outside. The ubiquitous little thing, for some reason too quiet and fidgety, was brought into a spacious room covered with an innumerable number of fuins, and many of the symbols were soaked in blood. Old, but very tasty. The blood of the Uzumaki clan. The fox barely restrained himself from licking his lips. And the child, having first pulled off his diaper, was already laid on the altar. The wide stone slab was covered with chips and cracks. It painfully dug into the child's body, greedily drinking the living warmth. And it was also soaked with the same blood. There had once been so much scarlet liquid that its streaks had grown into the stone so much that they had become an irreplaceable part of it. The fox felt each of the snakes, blackened by time, and was increasingly imbued with a sense of danger. Meanwhile, the hall began to fill with little men in white masks. Nine-Tails had seen such people more than once. These flies were the most annoying and demanding. For some reason, it was not so easy to kill them. There weren't many white-masked people. About 5 or 6 creatures. And only one stood out. He looked different from the others. The black fur on his head stuck out in all directions, and most of his face was hidden by bandages. But the beast wasn't fooled. The eyes of this creature concealed an insane danger. "Begin," croaked the one whom the demon rightly took for the leader. "Yes, Danzo-sama." One of the mask wearers immediately slid towards Naruto, starting to do strange things. The fox stared intently at the rapidly moving hands of this overly bold man. It seemed he had learned about seals from his father, so it wouldn't hurt to remember the unfamiliar technique and then figure it out. The demon was so immersed in the precise movements of the other man's fingers that he almost jumped up, feeling a sharp outflow of chakra. The picture before his eyes swam, obscured by darkness. The nine-tailed opened his already aching eyes even wider, regaining control of the situation. Chakra was leaking out of the child's body in spurts. The seal was hissing and even seemed to be weakening. The fox grinned and voluntarily increased the energy supply. The impudent little people were making their own lives difficult. The darkness slowly retreated. Scarlet stains began to spread across the water from the cage. The fox grinned, allowing the people to pump chakra out of him. Unlike them, the nine-tailed fox felt perfectly well that most of what was pumped out settled on the seal. Each new spurt of his power outward, even if only for a couple of days, brought the hour of his triumph closer. The image of the present still lingered before the fox's eyes, as the child had known it, lying on the cold stone. So cold that even the nine-tailed fox was beginning to feel the chills. "Stupid people!" The bijou couldn't help but grin contentedly. His voice echoed off the walls, seeming to cause the boy even more discomfort. And Naruto howled, starting to cry loudly. The demon grinned even more. At that moment, the loudness of the obnoxious little man even amused him. It awakened something in his soul, something dreamy and languidly contented. The demon's eyes sparkled with delight. "That's exactly how you'll scream when I get free. That's exactly how." The poisonous chakra slowly mixed with the water, filling the room, and hissing as it bit into the bars, beginning its slow journey to freedom. The fox slightly twitched his ears, enjoying her hissing, and settled in more comfortably. All he could do was wait. He was no longer bothered by the fact that the little people had finally taken the boy off the altar and were carrying him off somewhere again. "Wait, just wait." The tailed one breathed out barely audibly, still noticing that the little one was still whining. It seems that this sound will one day become so familiar that, breaking free, I will hear it. Although I would like to hear screams. The demon closed his eyes, shutting himself off from the world. The external no longer interested him. Everything most important had finally entered into reaction and also did not require special supervision. The delight subsided, leaving behind a languid boredom, and the fox, trying to kill some time, began to think. As usual out loud. The silence and darkness were filled with his barely audible hiss. The demon was making plans as usual. Although he had had plenty of thoughts about freedom before. Over the long decades, he had indulged in dreams of freedom more than once, often withdrawing into himself so deeply that he was not always aware of what was happening around him. And now the fox was so lost in his thoughts that he didn't notice how the walls began to shake and the water began to turn into steam with a hiss. The strange hum and heat grew, getting closer to the cage with each passing second. The demon sneezed, twitching his nose when his sensitive whiskers began to burn, and then opened his eyes and stared in disbelief at the water bubbling around him, which with each passing second was becoming more and more like jelly. Have the humans gone mad? The fox asked himself in a barely audible voice, examining the symbols of the fettering fuin surrounding the cage. Have they decided to hang something else on me through their squiggles? With one swing of his tails, he stripped the writing of its power, causing it to immediately begin to blur, turning into black, ugly blots. A couple of minutes after the failed attempt at immobilization, apparently the people were waiting for the technology to take effect. A bright light cut across the beast's eyes. Blue, green, orange. One after another, wide ribbons began to entangle the cage, forcing the fox to open his eyes even wider. Are you completely nuts? Growled the demon, sticking a claw through the hole between the bars and, ignoring the painful sensations, ripping the bright material. And how could you have the nerve to try to set bookmarks on me? The demon muttered under his breath again, wearily lowering himself onto the floor surface, warmed by the double attack of alien techniques. The cruelly torn ribbons were falling apart right before his eyes into thin threads, slowly growing heavier from the water. They did not lose their color, rather they faded slightly, slowly sinking into the depths, disappearing from the fox's field of vision. But Nine-Tailed understood perfectly well that this was not the end, and these impudent ropes would still weave their pattern somewhere deep in the soul of its bearer, greatly limiting this screaming baby. Good or bad? The fox drawled thoughtfully, practically burying his nose in the bars holding him back, as if trying to find an answer in the black water that had once again become motionless. Another bright flash cut through the air. It cut into the eyes, causing the demon to growl and close his eyes. Then the childish scream that was starting to become boring hit his ears. Again? Fox croaked. There was an unusual dullness in his growling voice. The demon tensed up. And there was a reason. The little one's squeaks did not attack his ears from all sides as they usually did, but came only from one side and without the usual build-up, depending on Naruto's mood. In addition, an unusual hum touched his sensitive ears, which was not and could not be in the boy's subconscious. This is what made the Nine-Tailed tense up even more and sharply open his closed eyes. And then squint in confusion. Around Fox was not the usual cage and the darkness of a room filled with water, but a snow-white emptiness of a room, in the center of which stood a lonely child's crib. He had already seen such when his previous vessel was about to give birth to this. Naruto. The child was screaming, his big mouth wide open. The roar was terrible, and even more terribly loud. More intense than in the subconscious. Brighter. But for some reason it sounded less irritating here. Maybe because everything around was filled with other sounds. Everything around was breathing and singing. The red fur was ruffled by a light wind, sliding in from the open window. Whoa! Demon tensed, no longer noticing the minor changes in the timbre of his voice. The fox, unable to examine himself from the side, spun around, noting that he was still red and looked like the same person he had been since his separation from Juby. Only the size, now demon, didn't even reach the knees of the impudent bugs called people. All nine tails began to sweep the floor in irritation, and the red nose twitched from side to side. The fox could barely suppress the urge to howl, expressing mad irritation. The main reserve of his chakra remained in the boy. The demon felt a good connection with this cub. The same power that was available to him now did not distinguish him much from an ordinary animal from the summoning scroll. How humiliating it was! "Shut up! You little monster!" The voice of one of the humans was muffled by the tightly closed door. And judging by what Fox heard, the guard was not going to check on the object of observation, but would rather continue to shout commandingly from the corridor until his patience ran out. And then, the demon could not guarantee that the enraged ninja would not try to kill the overly loud Uzumaki. The fox swore softly. Fortunately, his vocabulary was large for this occasion, and silently sliding to the crib with the struggling baby, nudged it with his nose, making it rock, and then slowly headed towards the window. What difference did it make what form, if he was free now? The demon always solved problems as they arose, and the main thing now was escape. While he carefully moved towards the slightly open window, the child was silent, frowning in concentration and looking at the swaying ceiling. But the lonely push did not last long, and the baby began to stir again, and then, opening his mouth wider, let out another cry. The demon shuddered, barely holding himself back from jumping to the side, and directed a tense gaze at the door. The sound of unhurried footsteps broke through the children's roulades. It was this that made the demon rush headlong back to the child and push the crib with his nose again, turning it into a quiet pendulum. And then again. And again. The child was silent. The sound of footsteps began to fade away. The demon sighed heavily, looking longingly at the greenery outside the window. "You're very problematic, Uzumaki Naruto, aren't you?" The baby laughed loudly, waving his plump little arms in time with the movements of the cradle. His blue eyes were burning with a bright fire. The boy would hardly let go of his forced nanny now. The setting sun was setting behind the horizon for the 5th time since the fox had escaped from his prison, albeit very conditionally. The demon watched with some kind of gloomy pleasure, as the sun's rays cast scarlet reflections on the mountain. The faces of the Hokage carved on it seemed to be stained with blood at this hour. Their strong-willed features, immortalized in stone, were becoming harder, imperceptibly to the eye. The fox enjoyed it. He remembered each of them, and, one way or another, he saw them on the threshold of death. These pleasant memories warmed his soul, until a quiet but persistent whine penetrated them. Little Uzumaki was waving his hands, demanding attention. And the Ninetales could only sigh heavily and, tearing himself away from the soothing pictures of the past, returned to the baby's crib. And rock, rock, rock. It seemed that over the last couple of months, which threatened to turn into a year with terrifying speed, Demon had begun to get used to the fact that his boring solitude could be broken at any moment. At the same time, Fox still hadn't figured out what it was connected with. But all signs pointed to the child brazenly reaching out to him with each new meeting. His blue eyes with drops of not yet dried tears greeted red every time, no matter what the day was, or maybe even the night. Each new meeting was like a breath of fresh air. Even if Fox would never admit it to anyone, he loved the world around him too much and missed it madly. So, even if only in snatches, unable to move away from the crib, he absorbed the feelings that had already been forgotten over the decades of confinement. The demon approached the window more and more often, peering into the sky, putting his nose up to the light breeze and snorting slightly. A pleasant languor was spinning in his head. Freedom intoxicated his mind, but for some reason it did not drive him crazy, but rather, on the contrary, it clarified him, peeled away layer after layer of fatigue and doomed hatred. And for some reason, the periodic bursts of childish laughter and sudden falls out of reality no longer irritated him. These leaps even amused him. After all, when else would he feel so alive? And although the freedom was somewhat doomed, again a leash and the impossibility of escaping, simply moving further than 5 jumps, but everything around lived, breathed, did not allow him to close in. And he did not want to sleep. At all. There was no eternal fatigue and doomed expectation that literally permeated his entire red body. Rather, some expectant tension. That strange technique was imprinted too well in his memory. The seal was slowly eaten away, very slowly, but now at least the fox knew what to strive for. The wind. The forest. Life. Besides, the chakra supply was replenished with each new exit from the vessel. Just a little. But the nine-tailed began to notice how the impermissibly small body was becoming larger, how the tails were fluffing up, and the strength was still there, and it seemed that any minute now he would be able to take a couple of steps further. There, out the window. But it was at that moment that the baby usually laughed loudly, as if reading thoughts, and everything was cut off. Sometimes the fox thought about the time frames of his outings. They were generally insanely chaotic. So much so that if someone very caring had not hung a calendar on the wall, it would have been very difficult to navigate. Naruto pulled him out of his sleepy anticipation once every 2 or 3 days, and then did not call for an entire month. The nine-tailed did not try to understand why the kid was calling him. It was clear anyway. He was lonely. Blue eyes shone with unchanging delight at the sight of the fox. And the demon himself devoured the calendar with his gaze, on which the date, October 10th, was boldly circled, and waited again. It seemed that the approach to this date made even the air around him thicker. This scarlet circle did not feel good, even formally. On this day another Uzumaki was born. Duh! The small headache exhaled loudly, again starting to wave its arms and frown. Still unsure, but very loud little voice again already habitually tore the fox away from contemplating someone else's free life, forcing him to growl barely audibly through his teeth and again push the annoying pendulum, which by an absurd coincidence was called the child's bed. The occupation was boring and monotonous, so 900th had long ago acquired the habit of talking. In a half-voice, he communicated with the small splinter, deep down rejoicing at the presence of an interlocutor, albeit silent. Although the little one very quickly ceased to be a speechless and easy-to-communicate listener. Now monotonous philosophizing was increasingly interrupted by loud sounds and bursts of laughter that confused his thoughts. On the day Naruto turned 1, everything went wrong for some reason. There was no usual pulling of the fox from the seal. This time, like the first time, the child himself looked in on him. He smiled, splashing his grown and stretched hands in the cold water. His blue eyes shone with delight, and his body, unusually naked, without the rags that constrained it, was strangely bent in tension. At the same time, the boy did not say a word. The demon watched with interest as the little Uzumaki, snorting stubbornly, rolled over onto his stomach, and then, putting his palms and heels slightly apart on the water, took the first step toward the cage. The beast thoughtfully watched the unsteady, uncertain jerks of the swaying little body, purposefully moving forward. The child, somehow unusual for a human, slightly stuck out his butt and swayed it, as if trying to help his progress. "You don't have a tail, little brat," the fox muttered irritably as the child crawled too close. "So don't flap your body, you'll make it worse." For some reason, this time the demon was not overcome by the desire to rush, to immediately tear apart, or, at least, to frighten the child. From within, some previously unknown feeling arose, spreading like a fiery wave throughout the pogromous body. It did not burn with the usual fiery lava, but warmed. The fox bared his teeth. A strange feeling was bothering him. He wanted to scratch himself furiously, trying to eradicate this unusual itch from his skin, from every hair of his fur, to the very tips of his tail. But his gaze did not leave the slowly approaching child, and his body refused to move. He even caught his breath. The air was filled with tension and uncertainty again. It seemed that at any moment, something unusual, something very significant would happen that would turn the entire fox world upside down, and not only it. "You imitate well," the nine-tails managed to squeeze out, collecting his thoughts, unconsciously moving even closer to the gilded bars and almost nose to nose colliding with Naruto. Blue eyes sparkled slightly in the semi-darkness, making the child's gaze insanely sharp and unchildlike in its attentiveness. The child smiled again, showing the fox 9 teeth. The demon snorted quietly. "No tails, no fangs, no claws. Useless little people." It was this moment that Naruto chose to confidently grab one of the bars of the cage and timidly stand up on 2 limbs. This action made the demon wince, trying to hold back the sudden urge to attack. Too deep were the wounds left by the same as him, bipeds. "Duh," the child said, slightly tilting his head to the shoulder, clearly feeling the sudden increase in tension, and then took his first uncertain step, squeezing the bars with clumsy fingers. "You'll get burned!" The demon suddenly exhaled, even to himself, jerking forward as if trying to catch the child, but only burning his fur on the glowing beams. The child froze for a couple of seconds, and then just as confidently extended his free palm forward, clutching his fingers at the slightly singed fur. Duh! The blue eyes seemed to have grown even larger, and the smile was so wide that it threatened to crawl out of the still plump face. The fox's fur, squeezed by a hand that was slightly trembling from the tension, seemed to give the child strength, and he, swaying slightly, continued to move step by step along the cage, forcing the quiet demon to follow. By the end of the mini-walk, the child was completely sweaty and had difficulty breathing, so he happily sank back down to the floor, resting his feet and palms on the stone. "That's even better," Fox finally said hesitantly, his voice trembling slightly as Naruto reached into the cage again, trying to reach the red-haired prisoner. The child's lips hesitantly began to stretch into a smile again. "Where he?" The scarlet eyes stared at the baby with distrust. The fox kept thinking he had misheard, and the world had chosen this very moment to ruin everything. The familiar prison atmosphere faded away. The nine-tailed fox could only clearly see the child in front of him, his blue eyes full of tears for some reason and his lips trembling. And then he saw the impudent midges called Shinobi again. It seemed he wasn't the only one who wasn't happy to see them. At least Naruto was screaming louder than usual, trying to wriggle out of the hard hands squeezing his body. The fox's claws raked across the stone, crushing it. The understanding that they would never return to this room was pounding in their heads. Their peace and privacy had been unceremoniously destroyed. Demon's gaze still managed to catch on the white sheet of the calendar, picking out the date. October 10th. Before they were carried out of the room that had become familiar for a year. The smells immediately filled his nose. Many and strong. One stood out in particular, soft, but with a slight bitterness and an admixture of iron. There was a lot of it. Thick, it filled everything around, curled very close, irritating sensitive receptors, broke up into 3 streams of very similar ones. Related. It drove the fox into a rage. Too familiar. Too disgusting. 2 black-haired figures flashed before my eyes, frozen at some distance. A woman and a child. No, 2 little ones. Uchiha. Madara. Chapter 6 The fox growled softly, looking through the eyes of a child at their new home, which resembled a prison even more than the previous room. Only now, although the cell was for one person, it was within sight of others. Naruto, who had cried the entire short, or rather, insanely fast the mask wearer almost broke his legs, he was in such a hurry to get rid of the demon, looked around as if he understood something. The nine-tailed obediently absorbed new knowledge about their location, while trying to calculate the probability of receiving damage from 24 small rascals, about Naruto's age, locked in structures that conditionally resembled cages without a top. The fox finally began to calm down, deciding that the children were not dangerous. For now, and he already knew what to expect from the grown individuals. His little one was predictably shoved into the darkest corner, trying to cut him off from the others. A gray wall with impressive cracks, poorly painted, obviously rotting boards, a musty smell. An iron, very unusual looking, miniature copy of an adult bed. All this caused a dull irritation in Demon. "A cage within a cage," he growled, closing his eyes again and listening to himself. For some reason, the gray bars infuriated him even more than the golden ones. But now he had a completely different problem, not related to the sleeping baby or the new place of residence. It was a smell. Familiar to the point of stinging the eyes. Thick. Obsessive. Haunting in every new nightmare. The smell of humiliation that was a thing of the past, but left a deep scar on the pride of the strongest of the tailed beasts. The fox twitched his whiskers slightly, rolling the familiar spicy iron bitterness on his tongue, with a slight hint of sweetness and milk. The distance between the demon and the smell carrier was quite large, and the cage greatly restricted the freedom of feelings, so the fox was not sure of the complete identity of the smell, as well as that it was really Madara in front of him. The bitterness of defeat and anger filled the entire demonic being, mixing with thin threads of uncertainty. All 9 tails pressed hard against the yellowish bars. The water around them foamed. After raging for a couple of minutes, the fox calmed down, again sinking to his previous place. The tails swept the floor in irritation, sometimes touching small puddles. Most of the water ended up outside the cage. It was even convenient, in a way. If only the mind had not again and again pulled humiliating images from memory. And in this regard, everything was even worse. Madara, Mito, Kushina. The faces of the most hated people in this world flashed in his mind again and again. He remembered them, every single one, down to the last line. His tormentors, his jailers. The people who had chained him. Laughed at him, taking away his strength. And this Naruto is the same. The demon raised his muzzle higher and growled loudly, releasing all his pain and rage. A hot wave of anger pierced the child's body like fragments, forcing the boy to wake up and close his eyes, curling into a ball. The child, as if understanding something, did not utter a sound, only quietly sobbed when the pain stopped shaking his fragile body, and he closed his eyes tighter, not letting the tears that had appeared in his eyes come out. And then he found himself right in front of the cage. Duh! The child's voice trembled, and the baby himself, clearly in a hurry and stumbling, hurried to overcome the already familiar water and almost fell inside the cage. At the last moment, trembling fingers caught on the wide bars. And only then did tears flow from the huge, unhappy eyes. Something inside Lise trembled. The child was not crying from pain or fear. Rather, it was despair and frustration. In the blue eyes there was only understanding and enormous, simply boundless forgiveness. What do you know, brat? The Ninetales suddenly rumbled in a hoarse voice. Naruto sobbed especially loudly, rubbing the salty moisture across his face with the fingers of his free hand. And then he reached forward, falling waist-deep between the bars. The fox only managed to jerk forward in fear. His trembling fingers squeezed the stiff fur with force, and then pulled it toward themselves. Carefully, but persistently. The demon shuddered, obediently making an uncertain movement towards him. And already the other hand touched the huge wet nose, the hot palm covered as much as it could in one movement, and then slid off, forcing the Ninetale to lean forward a couple more millimeters, following the awkward almost caress. The demon's huge eyes looked straight at the child, who was once again concentrating on stretching his open palm towards his huge muzzle, holding himself up with his other hand. Unusual. Strange. Very cautious and somehow insanely awkward. There was not a single thought left in the huge red head. The entire demonic body was filled with unfamiliar warmth. The tails slid uncertainly along the floor, darted forward like flexible snakes, fluffing up even more. The fox bristled his whiskers and froze, trying to catch a strange, long-forgotten feeling that was growing inside him. The warmth of the child's hand seemed to go deep into his body, and then spread throughout all his limbs, warming them. "You're strange," the hoarse voice whispered. The red ear twitched uncertainly. Naruto winced comically when a wave of warm breath washed over him. "Very strange," the fox repeated to himself. Memories full of pain and humiliation appeared before his eyes again, but this time they did not hurt, did not scratch something in the bleeding heart. Somewhere in the very depths of each of them, a forgotten warmth was felt. The memory tape kept rewinding until finally, before the mental gaze of the almost immortal being, a translucent figure of the one whom each of the 9 creations could call father appeared. "Dad," the fox breathed out almost silently, closing his eyes. At least here. In the darkness and silence, after so many years, he could call things by their proper names. Just once. In complete solitude. "Pa!" immediately resounded loudly around, bouncing off the walls. The demon opened his eyes in horror. "How?" The blue eyes looked seriously, thoughtfully. And the disobedient, slightly trembling childish lips repeated over and over again the first syllable of the most precious word for the fox. "Papa!" Uzumaki finally finished after 100 unsuccessful attempts. The huge blue lakes darkened, suddenly becoming insanely deep and understanding. Wise. Like the sage of the 6 paths. Even though this semblance of an obsession lasted only a couple of seconds, for the Ninetales they were more precious than more than half of the time that the world had allotted to him. As if trying to say thank you for awakening the brightest memories, the fox carefully covered the child's hand, located almost next to the ear, with the tip of his soft tail. The thin hairs touched the hot skin, making the child giggle. So unusually, so childishly subtle. The fox had never heard such laughter or seen such shining eyes directed at him from anyone except the new carrier. Even father had never looked at him like that. In Rikudo-san's eyes there was the tired warmth of a man who had done everything he had to, and a quiet sadness. In the eyes of the others, anger, hatred, determination. At the beginning. Towards the end, the bright, settling emotions gave way to tired acceptance and quiet irritation. Even the fear left their bodies, leaving only tense anticipation. Struggle and fatigue. They were strange. But now, looking into the softly glowing blue eyes, Fox felt a thin shoot of hope timidly appear in his chest. Completely uncertain. Brittle and defenseless. Dad, Dad! The baby exhaled once again, slightly tilting his head to his shoulder. Smiling warmly. The fox nudged the child's palm with his nose. Naruto. His uncertain voice, full of hidden hope, mixed with another, coming from outside. The voice was also quiet and trembling. A woman's. On the curved side of the second of the bars that held them in place stood a dark-haired woman with sad black eyes. An ordinary housewife, smelling of the kitchen and children. But the fox still tensed up, catching the smell of burning and iron. Very weak. And before it seemed to him simply all-consuming. But now, when anger did not cloud his mind, everything looked completely different. The Uchiha clan woman carefully extended her hand, passing it through the bars, her fingertips touching the blonde hair. "How are you, baby?" she whispered, looking at the seemingly sleeping child with some strange bitterness. A salty drop fell on the child's cheek, making him wince. Everything in the inner world was stirred up. Naruto was pulled in the opposite direction, and only thin fingers, tightly squeezing the red fur, kept him from returning to reality. And the woman continued to speak. "Forgive me for being so weak and spineless. For not having the ability to defend my opinion. Otherwise, you would not be here now, but in a dry, warm house. Next to my children." Unable to bear it any longer, she quietly sobbed. The fox sighed heavily, carefully pushing the child towards the exit with his nose. He even felt a little sorry for this descendant of Madara. A woman. Completely unhappy. Chapter 7 The smell of dampness and mold hit his nose again, making him wince. It was always like this now, when Naruto entered his subconscious. 3 weeks had passed since they had been transferred from the hospital to this almost basement. It seemed that the smell of musty oblivion had literally eaten into the skin of the little Uzumaki. It had soaked him completely, now systematically clogging the fox's nose. "Dad!" Naruto's eyes sparkled with satisfaction, already confidently moving his legs towards the cage. Simply amazing learning ability. As well as persistence. As soon as the baby realized that it was faster to move this way, he stubbornly began to get up on his feet, pushing off the floor again and again with his wet palms, and sometimes with his chubby cheeks and nose. Slender fingers familiarly touched the red fur. The fox didn't even flinch, only slightly opened his eyes, suppressing the desire to move away from the scorching heat of the rods. A slight tense tingling warned that he was too close to the seal. But Naruto didn't have to practically fall into the depths of the letters, so the fox still remained in place. Children's hands on the nose and red fur. Almost a ritual for both of them. It became so familiar. Like the visits of the woman of the cursed clan. Little Uchiha Mikoto. A woman bound by rules and a desire to please her husband. Her cage was even stronger than that of the strongest demon in this world. She came from the very first day. Again and again. Day after day. Only now she no longer stretched out her hands, but clenched her fingers, crushing the phalanges pale from the cold. Sometimes she cried quietly, and also talked a lot. About traditions, about the clan, duty, pain, and her own despair. As if she was apologizing, but she never once lowered her hands clasped on her chest. The little woman did not want to give in, although her voice was very eloquently hoarse when she called the name of her husband or clan. For the first time, the demon saw so many feelings in the eternal darkness of the damned eyes. He literally choked in them, drowned. It was too painful to see the boundaries of her cage. To watch her burn herself again and again on the bars, dropping salty drops. Sometimes it even seemed to Lisa that she was about to melt the bars of her terrible, suffocating prison with her tears, but Makoto, as if anticipating such moments, wiped away the moisture with her sleeve and pressed her fingers into the scarlet-white mon of the clan, once again locking herself in the eternal darkness of correctness and duty. The realization of her despair washed over her in waves with each tear. Naruto was soaked in it too. He received each of her words with furrowed brows, and sometimes he grimaced and pouted. Then Uchiha allowed herself a momentary paused smile. And the child smiled back at her. Little Uzumaki had some kind of incredibly infectious, simply magical smile. Maybe because it wasn't just his lips that were smiling. His whole being, starting with his huge, impossible eyes that didn't hide a single emotion and ending with the little fingers on his little feet, he was glowing, putting all of himself into each such directed emotion. Most of the smiles were still given to the fox. It was at him that the blue eyes looked most often, saturating him with their light, which, it seemed, was not going to end in the huge clear lakes of his naive gaze. As the days went by, the Uchiha clan became more and more visible, every action and tradition having a basis. The fox twitched his ears tensely and frowned, but he couldn't help but acknowledge the clan's overall thoughtfulness. Although that didn't stop them from being impudent gnats. Even if they became less annoying. Everyone. Except for Madara, perhaps. But then one day Mikoto didn't come. A day, 2, 3. Naruto began to smile less, and even when he was near the Nine Tails, he kept looking back, glancing towards the exit. The fox only closed his eyes. He understood the little girl Mikoto too well, chained by 2 children to the realities of the clan's life. A strong human girl who found the strength to resist the system, to come again and again, through pain. Every gesture of hers from the first day was full of that heart-rending despair, as if she was stepping over dozens of prohibitions. For the sake of her best friend, her memory, and also for the sake of her own conscience and herself. "She's strong," the fox finally murmured. For the first time, he felt respect for a human, and was proud that he could share her burden, if only for a short time. "You just have to believe in it," Fox finished, scorching the child with his breath. The child nodded contentedly, puffing out his cheeks comically. They waited another week. Both of them. Although somewhere deep inside, Fox knew that she would not come again. So it was a complete surprise to him when the door swung open again at an inopportune time. The shuffling, unfamiliar footsteps, coming closer, made him tense up. All 9 tails shot up into the air, twisting like snakes about to strike. It seemed his preparations had not gone unnoticed by the little boy. Naruto, as if taking over his daddy's anxiety, tensed his entire body, opening his already huge eyes even wider. It was as if he was about to take in the entire world with his gaze, to look around the entire room at once. To help the 9 tails concentrate better. The plump lips pursed. A little more, and a few childish teeth would have creaked from zeal. The fox was itching to say something soothing. The only thing that stopped him was the understanding that the child would not hear him. Not now. Especially not at the moment when almost all the space in front of my eyes was taken up by an old man's mug. Although people do say mug. And this one, it seems, was smiling. The fox bared his teeth in warning. His tails swept across the floor, leaving long nicks in the smooth stone. He didn't like this man. He really didn't like him. Just like Naruto, by the way. They both sensed the absolute falseness in this wrinkled shinobi. Demon had no doubts about this Morel's profession. Uzumaki agreed by default, washing the tailed one with warm waves of sympathy and support. Naruto! The old man stretched his lips into an even more vile smile, although for people, probably, it was inviting. You haven't changed at all. The blonde scowled, cautiously beginning to move away. The fox, on the contrary, leaned forward, as if he was about to attack. The bars of the cage glowed brighter. The sealed paper trembled menacingly as the fiery chakra pierced the lock with force, rushing out. So similar to his parents, the old man continued to rant. But the fox, in his rage, heard only selected fragments of a lengthy, pseudo-philosophical speech. Aimed at nowhere. Since the boy of 1.5 years was unlikely to understand more than a couple of words from what was said, and even missed them. And the demon heard. Not everything, but what Naruto clearly caught, passing through the suddenly strong lock of the Fuin, and this made him gnash his claws and rush about, throwing himself at the bars again and again. The old man did not hold back, telling about the death of the boy's parents, twisting many things in his own way, about the family resemblance and the future of the boy himself. Not much. Just in passing. His eyes sparkling, he spoke about chakra reserves and differences from other people. About a gift for the village. At the end, the old man once again flashed his eyes, scolded the silent child, ruffled his hair with a firm hand and, whispering that he couldn't wait for him to become a shinobi, left. The door slammed loudly. The fox, who had been hiding, became furious again. In response to his rage, Naruto snorted quietly, blinking away random tears. He didn't even want to cry because of this incomprehensible person. It was in this state that the workers of what looked like a children's prison found them when they came down to feed the young orphans. But they never approached the arena with the wild blonde. They were too frightened by the look of the unusually large eyes filled with devilish fire.